You're tuned in for another deep dive, and today we're tackling a really intricate subject, personality disorders.
Yeah, a complex area.
Definitely. What exactly are they, and
Hmm.
what are the forces that shape them? We've sifted through a collection of fascinating research
Mm-hmm.
to bring you the most insightful pieces of this complex puzzle.
Trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. Our journey today will explore the powerful connection between trauma and these disorders, the different faces trauma can wear,
Right.
when these patterns typically emerge, and we'll even zoom in a bit on how antisocial personality disorder is diagnosed, as an example.
That plan.
Our aim is really just to equip you with a solid understanding, keeping things clear, and hopefully genuinely engaging.
Absolutely. And you know what immediately jumps out from our sources is this consistently strong link between experiencing trauma
Right.
and the development of personality disorders. This isn't just like a casual observation.
No, it sounds pretty established.
It is, yeah. It's a well-established connection in the field. When we talk about negative early life events, things like abuse, neglect, or a deep sense of being abandoned.
Those really core, difficult experiences.
Exactly. These experiences can be particularly formative in setting the stage for personality traits to develop in a dysfunctional way.
Okay.
It's actually quite remarkable how frequently individuals diagnosed with certain personality disorders, borderline personality disorder being a key example, report a history of significant childhood maltreatment.
Wow. So BPD specifically shows high rates of that.
Yeah, the link there is particularly well documented in the sources we looked at.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into that then. It sounds like it's not just about encountering any hardship, but these early experiences carry a particular weight.
They really seem to.
And you mentioned the possibility of genetics playing a role as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's a crucial piece. The picture that emerges from the research isn't one of simple cause and effect, like A leads directly to B.
Right. It's rarely that simple in psychology.
Exactly. It seems more like a complex interplay. There might be an underlying genetic vulnerability, sort of a predisposition,
Okay.
and then these early negative experiences could act as a trigger, perhaps. Or maybe they guide how those predispositions actually manifest in a person's personality.
Huh. So it's not a straightforward formula, more of an intricate dance of factors. Nature and nurture, kind of.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The classic interaction.
Now, what's really striking is that the sources actually go into detail about how this link between trauma and personality disorders unfolds in specific conditions. It's not a one-size-fits-all explanation, is it?
Not at all, no. Several personality disorders show a strong tie to traumatic experiences, and the ways trauma contributes can be quite distinct for each one.
Which ones were highlighted?
Our sources specifically mentioned borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and avoidant personality disorder in this context.
Okay, that's quite a list. Let's focus on a couple of those. If we look at borderline personality disorder, or BPD, what were the key connections to trauma mentioned?
So for BPD, the sources really underscore how early trauma can interfere with developing a stable sense of self.
Identity issues.
Yeah, and also the ability to effectively manage emotions. It's as if those early emotional wounds make it significantly harder to build a solid, consistent foundation.
For identity and emotional regulation,
Exactly. Early trauma can lead to a kind of fragmented sense of self. Individuals struggle to integrate contradictory experiences and emotions.
making it difficult to form that cohesive identity.
Precisely. That's a core feature often linked back to trauma in BPD.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Now, what about narcissistic personality disorder, NPD? It's interesting because the outward presentation often seems like extreme confidence,
Right, grandiosity.
which you might not immediately associate with trauma. How do the sources explain that?
That's a really important point. The sources suggest that for some individuals with NPD, that outward grandiosity, that inflated sense of self-importance we often see,
Yeah.
it might actually function as a kind of defense mechanism.
A defense. Against what?
It could be a way to protect themselves from very deep-seated feelings of inadequacy or worthlessness that might have their roots in underlying traumatic experiences.
Wow. So the grandiosity covers up the insecurity stemming from
But
trauma.
that's the idea proposed, yes. It's a fascinating, almost paradoxical way that trauma can manifest outwardly. A protective shell, maybe?
It definitely challenges the initial assumptions you might have.
And me.
Okay, turning our attention to antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, we know there's a connection to trauma there as well, right?
Yes, a rather significant one, according to the research. A history of trauma, particularly experiences like neglect, abuse, or even just being repeatedly exposed to violence during childhood.
That kind of environment.
Yeah, that's something frequently observed in individuals diagnosed with ASPD.
And what's the thinking there? How does that environment contribute?
Well, what's particularly noteworthy is the idea that if a child grows up in an environment where violence or neglect is just normal, a
Yeah.
part of daily life,
Uh-huh.
then those antisocial behaviors can sadly become a kind of maladaptive way of coping with their circumstances, a learned survival strategy almost.
That really reframes those behaviors, doesn't it? Not excusing them, but
Exactly. It doesn't excuse them, of course, but it offers a deeper lens to understand their origins.
right. Okay, what about the other two you mentioned? Dependent and avoidant personality disorders. How does trauma figure into those?
Okay, so with dependent personality disorder, the connection to trauma often involving neglect, abandonment, or emotional loss in childhood.
Similar themes again?
Yes, that appears to foster that deep-seated feeling of inadequacy. This feeling can then lead to an excessive reliance on others for support, for decision-making, everything really.
So the trauma fuels the dependency.
That's the link suggested. And for avoidant personality disorder, experiences like emotional abuse or, say, severe bullying can lead individuals to become incredibly wary and hesitant in social interactions.
Almost phobic of social situations.
In a way, yes. They become hypervigilant, constantly fearing further emotional pain. Trauma, in this instance, really shapes their fundamental view of social interaction.
Making them feel inherently threatening.
Exactly. Inherently threatening, so they avoid them to protect themselves.
So it's becoming clear that trauma isn't just one thing. There are different types. And you said our sources actually provide a breakdown.
They do, yeah. We see distinctions made between acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma.
Complex trauma, is that sometimes called developmental trauma?
Yes, exactly. Complex trauma is often used synonymously with developmental trauma, especially when we're talking about the impact of those early childhood experiences we just discussed.
Okay, let's clarify those distinctions. Acute trauma, that's like a one-off event.
Precisely. A single, intense, distressing event. Think a serious accident, a physical or sexual assault, a natural disaster.
Right.
While the event itself is typically short-lived, time-limited, the emotional impact, the potential for lasting scars can still be significant.
Got it. And then chronic trauma sounds longer term.
Yes, exactly. Chronic trauma involves prolonged exposure to really stressful or harmful situations.
Like what kind of situations?
Think of ongoing domestic abuse, or experiencing a long-term severe illness without adequate support, or perhaps living in an active war zone, because it's sustained over time.
Mm-hmm.
Chronic trauma often has a more pervasive and potentially more damaging impact on mental health. It's frequently linked with conditions like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. And finally, complex trauma or developmental trauma.
Hmm.
This sounds particularly relevant to our discussion about personality disorders starting early.
Absolutely. It's highly relevant. This refers to repeated, long-term exposure to abusive or neglectful environments. And the sources really emphasize that this often occurs during critical periods of childhood development.
When the brain and personality are still forming.
Exactly. Given how foundational those early years are for shaping personality, it's not surprising that complex trauma has such a strong association with the later emergence of personality disorders.
How does it impact development so significantly?
Well, this type of trauma can really hinder the development of secure attachment, that basic sense of safety and trust in relationships. And it also impacts the ability to regulate emotions effectively. These are core building blocks.
Which makes sense why it's linked to personality disorders. Okay, this naturally leads us to the question of when these personality disorders typically start to show up. It's not something that just suddenly appears in midlife out of nowhere, is it?
No, generally not. The information from our sources is quite consistent on this point. Personality disorders usually begin to emerge in the teens or early adult years.
Adolescence or early adulthood?
Yes. Often, the patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that characterize these disorders can be traced back to adolescence.
Okay.
And these patterns tend to become more firmly ingrained, more stable as the individual moves into adulthood.
So it's really about a long-standing pattern, not a sudden onset.
Correct. A stable and long-lasting pattern of relating to oneself and others.
Right. Now, to get a clearer picture of how these conditions are actually identified, let's take that closer look at antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. The sources gave a fair amount of detail on the diagnosis, right?
Yes, they did. And it serves as a really useful example because the diagnostic criteria are quite specific and laid out.
So how does the process generally work? What does a mental health professional do?
Well, in general, they'll arrive at a diagnosis by carefully considering the individual's reported symptoms, their history, their life experiences, and also their family background.
A full picture.
A very full picture. They might also conduct medical evaluations to rule out any other underlying medical conditions that could be contributing to the behaviors they're seeing.
Makes sense. Rule out physical causes first.
Exactly. And it's also important to understand that it can take time. A clinician needs time to develop a comprehensive understanding of someone to make an accurate diagnosis. It's not usually a quick process.
Okay, so it's thorough and thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for ASPD specifically, we're looking at the DSM-5 criteria. That's the main diagnostic manual used in many places.
Yes, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition.
And it includes both general criteria for any personality disorder and then specific criteria just for ASPD.
That's right. You have to meet the general criteria first and then the specific ASPD criteria.
Okay, let's start with those general personality disorder criteria.
Mm.
What are the key elements there? What defines a personality disorder in general terms?
So the general criteria describe an enduring pattern of inner experience and outward behavior that deviates markedly, significantly from the expectations of the individual's culture.
Different from cultural norms.
Yes. And this pattern is inflexible, it's pervasive across a broad range of personal and social situations.
So not just in one specific area of life.
Correct. And it leads to clinically significant distress or impairment in important areas of functioning social, occupational, etc.
Okay. Distress or impairment.
Crucially, this pattern is stable, and its onset can be traced back at least to adolescence or early adulthood, like we discussed before.
Right, that long-standing nature.
And it also can't be better explained by another mental disorder or the direct physiological effects of a substance, like drug abuse or medication or another medical condition.
Got it. And it has to show up in specific areas.
Yes, it has to manifest in 2 or more of the following 4 areas. Cognition.
Which is thinking.
Right. Ways of perceiving and interpreting self, others, and events. For example, someone might have persistently distorted ways of thinking about themselves or other people.
Okay, cognition. What else?
Affectivity. This is about emotions, the range, intensity, lability, meaning how quickly they change, and the appropriateness of emotional responses.
Emotions. Got it. Third,
Interpersonal functioning, so how they relate to and interact with other people.
relationships. And the last one.
Impulse control. The ability or lack thereof to regulate urges and behaviors.
Okay. Cognition, affectivity, interpersonal functioning, impulse control. 2 or more of those need to be affected.
Correct, according to the general criteria.
Right. That gives us the broader framework. Now let's get to the specific criteria for antisocial personality disorder itself. This is criterion A in the DSM-5.
Yes, criterion A for ASPD.
This seems to pinpoint the core behaviors we're looking for with ASPD.
It does. Criterion A describes a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, and this pattern has been occurring since the age of 15 years.
Since age 15. Okay. And how is that shown?
To meet this specific criterion, the individual must exhibit at least 3 specific types of behaviors from a list.
3 or more. Okay, what's on the list?
Okay, first, failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors. This often shows up as repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest.
Okay, breaking laws.
Second, deceitfulness. This can involve repeated lying, using aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure.
Lying and manipulation.
Third, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, acting on the spur of the moment without thinking through consequences.
Impulsive. What's next?
Fourth, irritability and aggressiveness. This might manifest as frequent physical fights or assaults.
Aggression.
Fifth, reckless disregard for the safety of themselves or others, engaging in dangerous behaviors without concern for consequences.
Recklessness. Okay.
Sixth, consistent irresponsibility. This could be seen in things like repeatedly failing to sustain steady employment or honor financial obligations.
Irresponsibility. And the last one.
And seventh, lack of remorse. This is indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another person.
No guilt or remorse.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive set of indicators. At least 3 of those 7.
Yes, 3 or more since age 15 for criterion A.
And there are a couple of other criteria that need to be met for an ASPD diagnosis too, aren't there? You mentioned criteria B, C, and D.
That's right. They're also necessary. Criterion B is straightforward. The individual must be at least 18 years of age to receive the diagnosis.
Okay, must be an adult.
Criterion C requires documented evidence that the individual exhibited symptoms of conduct disorder before the age of 15.
Ah, so there needs to be a childhood history consistent with this pattern.
Yes, that link to conduct disorder is a key diagnostic requirement in the DSM-5 for ACE-MPD.
And criterion D.
Criterion D just specifies that the antisocial behavior must not occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder.
Meaning it's not just a symptom of those other conditions.
Exactly. It needs to be a persistent pattern outside of episodes related to those disorders.
It's interesting that the sources also mention the ICD-10 term, dissocial personality disorder. That's from the International Classification System.
Yes, the International Classification of Diseases, 10th revision. It's used more widely outside North America.
How does dissocial personality disorder compare to what we've just described for ICD and the DSM-5? Is it similar?
It's very similar, yes. Dissocial personality disorder, as defined in the ICD-10, describes a very similar constellation of characteristics.
Like what?
Key features include a callous unconcern for the feelings of others, a marked irresponsibility and disregard for social norms and obligations,
Okay.
an inability to maintain enduring relationships even though they might not have difficulty establishing them initially, also a very low tolerance for frustration and a low threshold for discharging aggression, including violence.
Similar to the irritability and aggression in DSM.
Yes. Also an inability to experience guilt or to profit from experience, particularly punishment.
That lack of remorse again.
Exactly. And a marked tendency to blame others or to offer plausible rationalizations for the behavior that has brought them into conflict with society.
Rationalizing bad behavior. Anything else?
Persistent irritability might also be present. Now, one difference is that while a history of childhood conduct disorder is often seen with ICD-10 dissocial personality disorder, it's not a strict diagnostic requirement like it is for ACE-PD and the DSM-5's Criterion C.
Ah, okay. A subtle but potentially important difference in criteria.
It can be, yes.
And when it comes to actually making the diagnosis beyond the clinical interview, are there specific tools or methods clinicians rely on? Questionnaires, maybe.
Yes, the sources do mention the use of structured clinical interviews and various questionnaires as important assessment tools for diagnosing personality disorders in general, not just ASPD.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Some commonly used ones mentioned include the SCID-2, the IPDE, the SID-PV, and the more current SCID-5PD, which aligns with the DSM-5.
So standardized tools to help guide the assessment.
Exactly. These tools are designed to help clinicians systematically evaluate the presence and severity of different personality disorder traits according to the established criteria. They add structure to the assessment.
Now, given that deceitfulness and manipulation can sometimes be part of the picture with ACPD, as we saw in the criteria,
Yes, that's a key point.
it makes sense that the diagnostic process would need to be particularly thorough and maybe even cautious.
Absolutely. Because of those potential features, the deceitfulness, the manipulation, the rationalization, it's often essential for clinicians to do more than just rely on the individual's self-report.
What else can they do?
They often need to integrate information gathered through their direct clinical assessments with information obtained from other reliable sources.
Like family members.
Yes, often referred to as collateral sources. This could include speaking with family members, maybe close friends, sometimes employers, or even reviewing past medical, legal, or school records.
To get corroborating information.
Precisely. It helps to develop a more complete and accurate understanding of the individual's long-term patterns of behavior, especially when the individual themselves might not be entirely forthcoming or objective.
That really highlights the complexities involved
Mm-hmm.
in diagnosing personality disorders, especially one like ASPD, where the person's own account might be unreliable.
It's definitely a challenging area of diagnosis.
Now, thinking back to the strong connections we've discussed throughout this link with trauma,
Yeah.
it seems that understanding is significantly shaping how these conditions are approached in therapy now.
That's precisely right. It's had a huge impact. Given that robust and well-documented link between experiencing trauma and the subsequent development of various personality disorders, trauma-informed therapy is now really considered a cornerstone of effective treatment.
Trauma-informed therapy. What does that actually involve?
Well, these therapeutic approaches are built on a foundational understanding of the profound and often lasting effects that trauma can have on an individual's development, their brain, their relationships, their functioning,
Yeah.
everything.
So it's a lens through which therapy is viewed.
Exactly. The aim is to integrate this understanding into all aspects of the therapeutic process, helping individuals to process their past traumatic experiences in a safe and supportive environment,
Okay.
to develop healthier and more adaptive ways of thinking about themselves and their relationships, and ultimately to improve their capacity for emotional regulation, which is often impaired by trauma.
So it directly addresses those underlying trauma-related issues.
Yes, rather than just focusing on the surface symptoms, it goes deeper.
So to kind of bring together the main threads of our deep dive today,
Hmm.
we've explored this really significant and multifaceted connection between various forms of trauma.
Acute, chronic, complex.
Right. Whether it's a singular acute event, the ongoing impact of chronic stress, or the really profound effects of repeated complex or developmental trauma, often experienced in childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and how that links to the development of a whole range of personality disorders.
Yeah, a really strong link across the board.
We've also noted that these patterns typically begin to surface in adolescence or early adulthood, and they tend to solidify into more enduring ways of being as people get older.
That onset period seems quite consistent.
And by examining antisocial personality disorder specifically, we've gained some valuable insight into the detailed and multifaceted process involved in actually reaching a diagnosis, including the specific criteria and the need for thorough assessment.
It gives a concrete example of the diagnostic complexity.
And perhaps most importantly, recognizing these deep connections between trauma and personality disorders isn't just, an academic exercise.
No, not at all.
It has crucial implications for how we help people.
Absolutely. It points towards developing more effective, compassionate, and ultimately more helpful trauma-informed approaches to therapy.
Which can offer genuine hope and pathways to healing.
Exactly. Pathways to healing for individuals who are grappling with these really challenging conditions. Understanding the role of trauma is key to that.
Absolutely. And on that note, maybe here's a final point for you, our listener, to reflect on.
Mm.
Considering the powerful and long-lasting impact of early life experiences, especially trauma,
Yeah.
on personality development, what broader responsibilities might society have?
That's a big question.
Yeah. Responsibilities in fostering healthy childhood environments, perhaps, and mitigating potential long-term effects on mental health and well-being.
It really makes you think about prevention and early intervention, doesn't it?
It does. It's a really important question to consider. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.